Ryan stared out of the window, his heart racing as the familiar black SUV pulled up in front of Luke's house. He could already feel the weight of the secret he was hiding from his best friend, a secret he hadn't intended to keep, until he had no other choice. It wasn't like Ryan wanted to fall for Jake. It wasn't part of the plan, but the magnetic pull he felt toward Luke's driver was undeniable. Ryan couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way Jake's deep, gravelly voice sent shivers down his spine, or how his calm demeanor contrasted so heavily with the chaotic energy that Luke always brought. Luke, his best friend since childhood, would never understand. They were supposed to be carefree, ready to take on the world together. College was just around the corner, and Ryan knew that they had only a few months left before everything would change. But nothing had prepared him for this. He wasn't even sure what this was. He only knew that every time Jake was around, something inside him stirred. Ryan had kept his sexuality hidden for years. It wasn't that his family or friends were particularly closed-minded, it was just that in their small Texas town, being openly gay would only add complications to a life that already felt too difficult. So, Ryan kept it all in, trying his best to navigate the social waters of high school without anyone suspecting a thing. But Jake was different. Jake, with his strong arms, short brown hair, and piercing green eyes, was the kind of man who made Ryan feel seen, like he wasn't just another kid from a small town but someone worthy of attention. Jake was in his mid-30s, and while that age gap would shock most people, Ryan couldn't help but feel drawn to the maturity and safety Jake seemed to offer. There was something dangerous about him too, something that made Ryan's pulse quicken every time their paths crossed. Tonight would be no different, Ryan thought, as he slung his backpack over his shoulder and jogged toward Luke's house. They were supposed to have one of their usual hangouts, just him, Luke, and Jake driving them to the diner like they always did. But something in Ryan's gut told him tonight was going to be different. As Ryan approached the front door, he saw Jake getting out of the car, his eyes catching Ryan's for just a moment longer than necessary. There was that silent understanding again, the unspoken connection between them. "Hey, Ryan," Luke shouted from inside the house, breaking the tension. "We're running late for the movie. You ready?" Ryan tore his gaze away from Jake and smiled at Luke, hoping his best friend didn't notice the subtle flush creeping up his neck. "Yeah, man, let's go." Jake opened the car door for them, his presence as calm and collected as always. Luke hopped into the backseat without a second thought, but Ryan hesitated for a moment before sliding in. He could feel Jake's eyes on him, even if only for a second. As they drove off, Luke was chattering away about their plans for the weekend, but Ryan couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting to Jake in the front seat, to the silent tension that was building between them. After the movie, the ride back was quieter. Luke had dozed off in the backseat, his head resting awkwardly against the window. Ryan, sitting in the passenger seat beside Jake, could feel the stillness in the air. It was heavy, charged. "You okay?" Jake asked, his voice low and steady, barely loud enough to wake Luke. Ryan nodded, staring straight ahead. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." Jake glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "You've been acting different lately." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. Had Jake noticed? Different how? "I don't know," Jake shrugged, keeping his eyes on the road. "Just distant." Ryan's mouth went dry. He didn't know what to say. All he could think about was how close they were, how easy it would be to reach over and touch Jake's hand on the steering wheel. But he couldn't. Not with Luke in the backseat. "I've just got a lot on my mind," Ryan replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He could feel the weight of everything he wasn't saying, the tension that was thickening the air between them. Jake didn't push further. He just nodded, but the silence that followed was louder than anything either of them could have said. When they pulled up to Luke's house, Jake parked the car but didn't turn off the engine. Luke was still fast asleep in the back, snoring softly. Ryan sat there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The tension between him and Jake was almost unbearable now. "You should wake him up," Jake said quietly. Ryan turned to look at Luke, but his mind was still on Jake. His pulse was racing, his chest tightening. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the silence. But before he could, Jake reached over and lightly touched his arm. The contact sent a shockwave through Ryan, and he froze, his breath catching in his throat. "You okay, Ryan?" Jake's voice was softer now, more concerned. Ryan couldn't bring himself to look at Jake. He was too scared that if he did, it would be obvious that he was feeling things he shouldn't be feeling. "I'm fine," Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. But he wasn't fine. He was far from fine. That night, after Luke had stumbled inside, still half asleep, Ryan found himself lingering by the car, his heart racing. Jake had stayed outside too, leaning against the hood, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. Ryan knew he should go home. He knew he should walk away. But something kept him rooted to the spot. Jake glanced at him, his green eyes glinting in the dim light. "You sure you're all right?" Ryan bit his lip, struggling to find the words. "No." Jake pushed himself off the car, his brow furrowed in concern. "What's going on?" Ryan could feel his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The moment he had been dreading, and wanting, for months. I can't stop thinking about you," Ryan finally blurted out, his voice shaky. "And I know it's wrong, but I can't help it." Jake stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Ryan was terrified that he had said too much, that he had ruined everything. But then, Jake took a step closer. "It's not wrong, Ryan," Jake said softly, his voice low and calming. "You're just confused." Ryan shook his head, his emotions overwhelming him. "No, I'm not confused. I've known for a long time." The air between them seemed to thicken as Jake took another step closer. Ryan's heart was in his throat now, and he could barely breathe. "Ryan," Jake whispered, his voice a mix of caution and desire. "We can't do this." "I know," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't care." And with that, Ryan closed the distance between them, pressing his lips to Jake's in a kiss that was both hesitant and desperate. Jake didn't pull away. He kissed Ryan back, his hands coming up to cup Ryan's face. It was soft at first, tentative, but then it deepened, became more urgent. Ryan could feel the warmth of Jake's body against his, the roughness of his hands, and for a moment, everything else faded away. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing heavily, their foreheads resting against each other. "We can't let anyone find out," Jake murmured, his breath warm against Ryan's skin. "I know," Ryan whispered, his heart still racing. "I won't tell anyone." And just like that, they had crossed a line that neither of them could uncross. For the next few weeks, Ryan's world became a whirlwind of emotions. On the surface, nothing seemed to have changed. He and Luke continued their usual routine, hanging out, playing video games, making plans for college, but everything felt different to Ryan. Every time they were at Luke's house, his eyes would wander to Jake, and his heart would race when Jake glanced back. Their secret relationship, once only a fleeting thought, had now taken on a life of its own. Late-night texts, secret glances, and stolen moments in the shadows kept the fire burning between them. But with every passing day, the weight of secrecy grew heavier, and Ryan's guilt gnawed at him. The moments they shared were brief but intense. Sometimes, Ryan would find excuses to stay behind after Luke had gone to bed, lingering in the driveway until Jake appeared. They would talk in hushed voices, always careful, always aware of how close they were to being caught. One night, after one of these secret meetings, Ryan snuck back into his room, his head buzzing with excitement and fear. He couldn't sleep, his mind replaying the feel of Jake's hands on him, the warmth of his breath against his neck. But even in the haze of these stolen moments, Ryan knew something was bound to go wrong. The pressure of keeping everything hidden started to affect Ryan. Luke, always observant in his own way, began to notice the changes. "Dude, you've been weird lately," Luke said one afternoon as they played basketball in his driveway. Ryan missed an easy shot, and Luke frowned. "You're distracted all the time. Is there something going on with you?" Ryan forced a laugh, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Nah, I'm fine. Just college stuff, I guess. You know how it is." Luke stared at him for a moment, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, but this feels different. You'd tell me if something was wrong, right?" Ryan's heart twisted. He hated lying to Luke, his best friend who had always been there for him. But how could he possibly tell him the truth? "Of course, man," Ryan lied, forcing a grin. "It's nothing. Promise." But Luke wasn't convinced. He shrugged it off for the moment, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. Later that night, when Ryan was once again sneaking around with Jake, the guilt hit him harder than ever. They were parked at the edge of a field outside of town, far from prying eyes. The moonlight streamed in through the windows of Jake's truck as they kissed, but for the first time, Ryan pulled away, the weight of everything crashing down on him. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Ryan said, his voice shaking. "It's too much. Luke's already suspicious." Jake sighed, leaning back in his seat. "I told you this was risky, Ryan. It's not going to get easier." "I know," Ryan whispered, rubbing his hands over his face. "But I can't stop. I don't want to stop." Jake reached out, his hand finding Ryan's. "Neither do I," he said softly. "But you need to figure out what you want, Ryan. Because eventually, this is all going to come out. Secrets don't stay hidden forever." It didn't take long for Jake's warning to come true. One afternoon, while Luke's parents were out of town, Ryan and Luke had planned a small get-together with a few friends at Luke's place. It was supposed to be a casual afternoon, nothing out of the ordinary, but everything went wrong when Madison showed up. Madison had always been close to Ryan, but lately, she had been dropping more and more hints that she wanted something more. Ryan had tried to keep his distance, but in a small town like theirs, it was hard to avoid her for long. When she arrived at the party, Madison immediately latched onto Ryan, pulling him away from the group to talk privately. "Ryan, we've known each other forever," she began, her voice soft and serious. "I need to know, is there something between us? Because I feel like there could be." Ryan froze, panic rising in his chest. This was the last thing he needed. Madison was sweet and kind, and he didn't want to hurt her, but the truth was there was no future for them. He could never be with her. I don't know, Madison," Ryan stammered, his eyes darting around, looking for an escape. Madison frowned, stepping closer. "Ryan, come on. You can talk to me. What's going on? Why are you so distant lately?" Before Ryan could answer, Luke appeared, his expression suspicious. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking between the two of them. Madison crossed her arms, clearly frustrated. "I'm trying to figure that out. Ryan's been acting weird for weeks. It's like he's hiding something." Luke's eyes narrowed. "Yeah, I've noticed that too." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. This was spiraling out of control. He needed to get out of this conversation before things got worse, but Luke wasn't letting him off the hook. "Come on, man," Luke said, his tone serious now. "What's going on? Is there something you're not telling us?" Ryan felt trapped. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, there was a knock on the front door. Jake had arrived to pick up Luke for an errand, and when he stepped inside, everything seemed to freeze. Ryan's heart skipped a beat as his eyes met Jake's, and in that split second, Luke noticed. The way Ryan looked at Jake, the way his breath hitched, everything was suddenly clear. Luke's expression changed. His eyes widened as the pieces fell into place, and when he turned to Ryan, his face was full of disbelief and anger. "Wait, are you serious?" Luke asked, his voice rising. "You, and Jake." Ryan's blood ran cold. "Luke, But Luke wasn't listening. He stepped back, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is why you've been acting so weird. You're hooking up with my driver." Madison's eyes widened in shock, and the room seemed to spin as Ryan tried to find the right words. "Luke, it's not what you think," Ryan pleaded, his voice breaking. "It just happened. Not what I think," Luke shouted, his voice filled with hurt and betrayal. "You've been lying to me for weeks. You're supposed to be my best friend, and this is what you do." Jake, standing near the door, looked helpless, his eyes full of regret. "Luke, let me explain." But Luke cut him off. "I don't want to hear it. Both of you, just get out." Ryan's heart shattered as he saw the hurt in Luke's eyes, but he knew there was nothing he could say to fix it. The secret was out, and everything was falling apart. The next few days were a blur of emotions. Luke refused to talk to Ryan, and the friendship that had once meant everything to both of them seemed irreparably broken. Ryan felt lost, his heart aching not only for the friendship he had ruined but for the complicated feelings he had for Jake. Jake tried to reach out to Ryan, but every time they spoke, Ryan felt overwhelmed by guilt. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything was his fault, that he had destroyed the one stable thing in his life, his friendship with Luke. Madison, who had witnessed the entire blow-up, distanced herself from Ryan as well. She didn't know how to process the revelation, and her attempts to understand left her feeling confused and hurt. Ryan spent most of his days alone, trying to figure out how everything had gone so wrong. He missed Luke, but he also couldn't deny the feelings he had for Jake. It was a tangled mess, and he had no idea how to fix it. One night, about a week after the confrontation, Jake showed up at Ryan's house. It was late, and Ryan was sitting alone in his room, staring at his phone, wondering if Luke would ever forgive him. When Jake knocked on the door, Ryan felt a mix of emotions: relief, guilt, and fear. He opened the door, and Jake stood there, his expression serious. "We need to talk," Jake said. Ryan nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They sat down on the edge of Ryan's bed, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavy in the air. "I can't keep doing this," Ryan whispered, his voice breaking. "I've ruined everything." Jake reached for Ryan's hand, his touch gentle. "This isn't all on you, Ryan. I'm just as responsible." Ryan shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "But I lied to Luke. I've lost him. I don't know if I'll ever get him back." Jake sighed, his brow furrowing in concern. "You need to give him time. This is a lot for him to process. But Ryan, you also need to think about what you want. We can't keep hiding forever." "I don't even know what I want anymore," Ryan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to Ryan's forehead. "You'll figure it out. And whatever happens, I'll be here." The days that followed were some of the hardest of Ryan's life. He spent hours lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in his mind: Luke's devastated face, Madison's shocked expression, and the undeniable connection he felt with Jake. It was all too much, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make sense of the mess he had created. He had texted Luke several times, trying to apologize, trying to explain, but Luke had either ignored his messages or responded with short, angry texts telling him to leave him alone. The weight of losing his best friend was unbearable. Luke had been more than a friend, he had been family. Ryan didn't know how to live in a world where they weren't inseparable. Madison was no better. She had stopped talking to him completely, and though Ryan tried to explain that his feelings for her had never been romantic, he knew that the way everything had come out had hurt her deeply. The only constant in Ryan's life was Jake. But even their relationship was filled with uncertainty. Jake was there for him, always a steady presence, but Ryan knew that Jake was also conflicted. He could see it in his eyes, the way Jake would hesitate before holding him, the way he seemed to carry the guilt of their secret relationship just as heavily as Ryan did. One evening, about 2 weeks after the big blow-up, Ryan was sitting on the porch, staring out at the sunset, when he saw Jake's truck pull up. He had been expecting him. Jake had texted earlier saying they needed to talk. But Ryan wasn't sure if he was ready for whatever conversation was coming. Jake got out of the truck and walked over, his face serious but soft. He sat down next to Ryan on the porch steps, the silence between them almost comforting. They didn't need to speak to know that both of them were struggling with the weight of everything. "I've been thinking a lot about us," Jake said after a while, breaking the silence. Ryan looked down at his hands, his stomach twisting. "Yeah," Jake nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "I care about you, Ryan. More than I've cared about anyone in a long time. But I can't keep doing this if it's tearing you apart." Ryan swallowed hard, his chest tightening. "It's not you, Jake. It's everything else. Luke, Madison, this town. I don't know how to fix any of it." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know you're hurting. But maybe it's time to stop hiding. You're not going to be able to make everyone happy, and trying to keep this a secret is only hurting you more." Ryan felt a lump form in his throat. "You think I should come out? I think you should do whatever feels right for you," Jake said gently. "But hiding who we are, isn't going to fix anything." Ryan stared at the horizon, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting everything in shades of pink and gold. He had been so afraid of what people would think, of what Luke would think, that he hadn't allowed himself to be honest. Not with Luke, not with himself. "I don't want to lose you," Ryan whispered, his voice barely audible. Jake reached for Ryan's hand, squeezing it gently. "You're not going to lose me. But you need to decide what's more important, keeping this secret or living your truth." Ryan closed his eyes, the weight of Jake's words sinking in. He had been living in fear for so long, afraid of what might happen if people knew. But Jake was right. He couldn't keep running from this forever. I'll do it, Ryan said quietly, opening his eyes and looking at Jake. I'll tell Luke. I'll tell him everything. Jake nodded, a mix of relief and sadness in his eyes. It's going to be hard. But I'll be here, no matter what. The next day, Ryan found himself standing outside Luke's house, his heart racing. He hadn't spoken to Luke in 2 weeks, and he wasn't sure how this conversation was going to go. But he knew he had to do it. He owed it to Luke, to himself. He knocked on the door, his stomach in knots. A few moments later, Luke opened the door, his expression cold and distant. "What do you want?" Luke asked, crossing his arms. Ryan took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I need to talk to you. Please. Just, hear me out." Luke hesitated for a moment, then sighed and stepped aside, letting Ryan in. They sat down in the living room, the tension between them thick and uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Luke," Ryan began, his voice shaky. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I never meant to hurt you." Luke stared at him, his jaw clenched. "You lied to me, Ryan. For months. You were sneaking around with my driver behind my back. How am I supposed to get past that?" "I know," Ryan said, his voice breaking. "I know I messed up. But it wasn't just about Jake. It was about me, about who I am." Luke frowned, his arms still crossed. "What are you talking about?" Ryan took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I'm gay, Luke. I've known for a long time, but I was too scared to tell anyone. I didn't know how you'd react, or how anyone else would react. And then, I met Jake, and everything just happened." Luke stared at him, his expression softening slightly, but the hurt was still there. "You should have told me." "I know," Ryan whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. "But I didn't know how. I didn't want to lose you. You're my best friend, Luke. I couldn't bear the thought of you hating me." Luke was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I don't hate you, Ryan. I'm just angry. Hurt. You kept this huge part of your life from me. And Jake, he should have known better." Ryan wiped his eyes, his heart aching. "I'm sorry, Luke. I really am. I never wanted things to get this messed up." Luke sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I need time, Ryan. I don't know how to process all of this right now. But I don't hate you. I need some space." Ryan nodded, understanding. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was something. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here whenever you're ready." Luke stood up, walking toward the door. "I'm glad you told me, though. I mean that." Ryan managed a small, sad smile. "Thanks, Luke." As Ryan left Luke's house, he felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. He had finally told the truth, but he knew it would take time for things to heal. At least now, there was no more hiding. In the weeks that followed, Ryan began to feel a weight lifting off his shoulders. He had told Luke the truth, and while their friendship was still strained, there was hope that one day things might return to normal. Madison had also reached out to him, offering her support and letting him know that while she was still processing everything, she didn't hate him. Slowly, life was beginning to feel a little more manageable. Jake, true to his word, had stayed by Ryan's side. Their relationship had shifted slightly, less secretive, more open, but there was still a lingering sense of caution between them. Jake knew that Ryan needed time to heal, to figure out who he was without the burden of secrecy. One evening, as they sat together in Jake's truck, parked at their usual spot by the field, Ryan looked over at him and smiled. "I'm glad we're still doing this," Ryan said softly. Jake smiled back, his hand resting on Ryan's knee. "Me too." Ryan leaned his head against Jake's shoulder, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. There were still challenges ahead, conversations with family, with friends, and with Luke, but for the first time in his life, Ryan felt like he was finally living his truth. And that was enough. A year had passed since Ryan had come out to Luke, and life had settled into a new normal. Luke and Ryan's friendship had healed over time, though things were never quite the same. Luke had eventually forgiven Ryan, but the distance between them was a reminder of how much had changed. Madison had moved on, finding love with someone new, and Ryan was happy for her. They had repaired their friendship, though it, too, was different now. As for Jake and Ryan, they had grown stronger together. Ryan had learned to balance his relationship with Jake with his other responsibilities, and though they still kept a low profile in their small town, their love was no longer a secret. On a quiet evening, as they sat together watching the sunset from the porch of Ryan's house, Ryan took Jake's hand and smiled. "Everything's different now," Ryan said softly. Jake squeezed his hand. "Yeah, but different isn't always bad." Ryan nodded, leaning into Jake. The weight of secrecy was gone, replaced by something stronger, something real. And as they sat there, watching the last rays of sunlight fade into the horizon, Ryan knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he wasn't facing them alone.